Hello, I'm Christina Preseni from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the webinar SART Foundations. This is one of many webinars you can find in the SART Toolkit at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. NSVRC would like to thank the Office for Victims of Crime for their support and funding of this webinar and the entire SART Toolkit. We would also like to offer the disclaimer that the opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the United States Department of Justice. Again, the website for the SART Toolkit is www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. Without further ado, we are really excited to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. These are two wonderfully experienced folks in this field who are going to chat with you about their SART work.
Thank you all for joining us. My name is Gosia Schmitz, and I'm the 17th Judicial Sex Assault Response Team Coordinator in Colorado.
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Ingarfield, and I am a consultant primarily focusing on sexual violence research and evaluation and sexual assault response team training and technical assistance. We're happy to be here today. All right, so we're going to jump right in. We talk a lot about sexual assault response teams, SARTs, and oftentimes, while it is a frequent part of our vocabulary, we don't think often about what does it take to actually put together a SART and get one going. And so oftentimes we struggle in bringing disparate voices together to the same table, even though we're all trying to address the same problem. And so there's a lot of suspicion, I think, that's out there around establishing a SART. And so we wanted to do this webinar for you all to help you think about, if you're wondering what it takes, that hopefully we can answer some of those questions for you. So a couple of things to think about before we start out is that it's really important not to cut corners. You don't want to rush putting together a SART, because if you want it to be sustainable, it needs to have a really strong foundation. There are a lot of things to think about, yes, but it doesn't have to be a difficult process. You can achieve a great deal simply by opening lines of communication and developing shared policies and practices among agencies who are all trying to address the same problem, which is support survivors, prevent sexual violence, and hold offenders accountable. And that's one of the key things, is that folks at the table recognizing that you're all working towards that same goal. And while past relationships, past conflicts that may have existed in your small or large community are there and they happened, it's important not to be tied down by those. It's also important to be able to develop solutions and move forward. And then the last thing I'll say on this first slide is that it's really important to not stop at understanding the SART as simply a monthly or quarterly meeting of people who talk about stuff and then nothing really gets done, right? The SART is so much more, and like the picture depicts there, it really presents a community with a good opportunity and a good chance to proactively work on change in their community.
So what exactly is a SART? A definition is that it's a multidisciplinary interagency team of individuals, collaborative working relationships that provide services for the community by offering specialized sexual assault intervention services. So that is very broad. We will break it down a little bit more for you.
So when you're thinking about a team that's trying to do the information on the previous slide, it's really important to remember that they're specialized to fit the needs of each community. So you have a community of 6,000 people, the needs there are going to be very different than the needs of a large urban community, the size of Chicago, right? So it's really, that's an important thing to understand as we go through these slides, that there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. And as we talk about opportunities and ideas to remember that they can be adapted for your specific needs. So ultimately, right, a general goal of a SART is to increase reporting and conviction of sex assault offenders, and then countering the experience of sexual trauma with a sensitive and competent response. And so often those sensitive and competent response pieces come when people work together and they work across disciplines with a shared goal.
And as just a side note, we have in our experience encountered agencies that often when they hear that a goal is to increase reporting, they think that it means that suddenly somehow sex assault, which has never been occurring in their community, suddenly is occurring, which we all know to not be true. And so really it's to help folks recognize that by increasing reporting, if you are taking the veil of secrecy off of what's happening in the community and hopefully resulting in conviction of those sex assault offenders. So a little bit about the SART history. They were first developed in the 1970s, and this was in a response to the need for a more integrated and streamlined approach to victim survivor support and offender accountability. All these agencies were working towards these similar goals. However, they felt like they were working against one another rather than together, and this would sometimes result in victims and survivors not receiving the best outcomes. They were also developed to address low reporting and prosecution rates, victim blaming and rape myths, which we're still seeing both of those to this day, and underutilization of SANE programs in general medical care. In fact, in the 1970s, most folks did not know what a SANE program is.
Okay, do you want to?
So yeah, to go off of that, the reason this graphic here, what we wanted to show you is of 100 rapes that are committed, you can see how this quickly goes down to only 0.2 to 2.8% of offenders are ever incarcerated. And another reason, one thing to note within this chart here is these are rapes that have somehow been reported, not necessarily to law enforcement, but to community advocacy agencies or maybe to the hospital. We know that many folks that have been sexually assaulted never tell a single soul. So this number, you can definitely imagine that it's a lot larger in terms of how many are committed, but the incarceration rate remains the same.
And this image is often referred to as the justice gap, and if you're interested in learning more about that, the reference for the article that included this data and this image is at the end of this presentation on the reference sheet. So, you know, one of the things that you're all probably aware of is that there's a lot of silos that exist in sex assault response. As Gosia mentioned, folks are working in opposition to each other or without communication between their respective agencies for whatever reason, and it's just always been that way. And so obviously over the last couple of decades, things have started to shift, and as multidisciplinary teams and SARTs have gained in popularity, we are seeing those silos breaking down. And so, you know, a SART was such a pivotal element of the change in the criminal justice system and with community-based advocacy and medical providers in terms of really breaking down those silos and reducing the contention that has often existed between agencies and this feeling of you're trying to take over what I'm doing, or you don't have a say in this, or I know what I'm doing better than you. A SART, you know, historically has really had a monumental effect on changing some of those attitudes by encouraging people working together. So we've talked about this a little bit already. Major purpose of the response team model is intended to minimize the number of contacts a victim or survivor has as they proceed through the criminal justice system. So many of you listening to this will already be aware of the desire that we have to reduce the number of times a victim or survivor has to share their story. So historically, perhaps they would be sharing their story with a friend or a family member, and then perhaps with an advocate. And then they'd have to share it again with a patrol officer and with a detective, and then perhaps a victim advocate at the law enforcement agency. Perhaps they sought medical care, and so there was a doctor and perhaps a couple of nurses that were involved there. And the list goes on and on. And so this was fatiguing and really challenging for survivors who had experienced something so very traumatic. And so we were seeing, high numbers of survivors dropping out of the process, and they weren't interested in staying involved. And a major purpose of a SART is to think about how can we do this differently? How can this pipeline look better for a survivor so that they're not having to repeat their story? So they're not having to engage with individuals who explicitly have an air of disbelief about them. And I think that that's something that folks in the 70s and 80s started to realize and started to shift through the establishment of SARTs.
Yeah, and I think that we also, as a group, know that generally most people don't even like to share their consensual sexual encounters with strangers. So what we were seeing, our folks are not only having to recount a sexual encounter, but an unwanted one, and most often than not, a very, very traumatizing one. So again, this is a reason why we were just seeing folks dropping out and no longer participating.
So one of the big questions then is starting a SART really that suspicious of an idea? You might have already broached this issue in your community if you don't currently have a SART, and it may have had a mixed reception, maybe some raised eyebrows. I think some of the struggles is this hangover that still exists of distrust between agencies and a resistance, unwillingness. I'm not sure how you would want to frame that in terms of recognizing that we're all working towards the same goal, and whether you're a community-based advocate or a detective of the sex crimes unit, ultimately you want to support that survivor and you want to hold the offender accountable. And obviously not every survivor wants a criminal justice process. That's not necessarily their understanding of justice or healing. But if you're not working together, if you're not talking with each other, then it's really difficult to provide good and seamless service to survivors. However, with that can come suspicion. Advocates shouldn't be telling me what to do. I'm a law enforcement official. The DA should not be telling me how I need to investigate a case because that's my purview. Or the DA getting frustrated with law enforcement officials who they don't feel like are doing full and thorough investigation. Or a hospital not calling community-based advocates. And so there's already this air of suspicion or distrust that permeates a lot of this work. And that obviously varies depending on your community. But Gosia and I don't believe that starting a SART is that suspicious of an idea. We actually think it's a really great idea. And if you can get enough people at the table and help them understand that it's a great idea, then I think, a rolling stone will gather moss. I think that's the phrase. But it's not a wolf in sheep's clothing, although I think some people think it is. The other thing that's really important about a SART, as you're talking about this within your community, is that they can facilitate a move away from this system of opposites that we've created, good, bad, wrong, or right. So you're doing it right, I'm doing it right, you're doing it wrong, or that's a good way to do it, that's a bad way to do it. And so this, there's no gray, right? When we know actually there's a ton of gray, and part of being able to talk to each other and come together is that we can reframe those conversations and recognize that we're working to balance versus in opposition of each other. So I think it presents a fantastic opportunity to have those conversations.
Yeah, and just as an example of that, we have spoken to where law enforcement has felt that community-based advocates tell survivor victims to not engage with law enforcement. Conversely, the victim or the community-based advocates feel that law enforcement doesn't ever want to use them and they're not sure why. So it's really getting away from not looking at it as community-based advocates, we are always doing it correctly and law enforcement doesn't understand. And law enforcement also not thinking community advocates only want to get in the way and they don't want to let us do our job. Those are those opposites that really fight against one another, versus when you take away those barriers and those blocks and allow folks to talk to one another, realize that while you're coming at it from a different standpoint, or you're coming at it differently, you are working towards the same goal, and perhaps by having a conversation, you may see how you can help one another in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that comes up is, what do you call your team? And so the work that I've done across the state, and Gosia works with a number of other SART coordinators across the state, is we have seen a whole host of names. And in many ways, the names are just semantics. It's a label that you give yourself that does have value, and it ultimately should have meaning to the team itself. So we have included a couple of slides here with all of the different names that we have encountered. So we've got, obviously, your MDTs. We know of sexual assault interagency councils, child adult abuse response teams, sexual assault multidisciplinary action response team. That one's a bit of a mouthful. Good acronym, though. And then sex assault response committees or councils, actual response teams. So the name is an actual response team. The team actually responds. So it's like 4 or 5 people who are paged, and then they are called out within a community to respond to a sex assault survivor. Case review teams, task forces, interagency councils. So as you can see, there's a plethora of titles that you could name yourself, so I don't need to get hung up on that. We have that struggle here. We have interagency councils and response teams and a couple of other names, and they're, by and large, they do the same thing, but people kind of get stuck on why they have different names, and that is not super important in the scheme of things, and you need to develop a team that fits your community's needs.
It also helps with identity development. We know, as Lisa had mentioned, we've come across many different ways that SARTs work and function here in Colorado, for example. So we do have teams that their purpose is to do case reviews. So they call themselves differently than perhaps task forces. And we also have councils that meet regularly, and then, for example, monthly, and then quarterly they will have their entire team meet. So again, like Lisa was mentioning, it all depends on the identity of the community that you're in. So the role of the SART, what can a SART really do? Definitely support victims and survivors' rights. We know that in the criminal justice world, a victim survivor's rights feel that they are often not heard and not as important as others. So the role of the SART is really to keep that at the forefront. Also holding offenders accountable. So this is, again, a reminder that what had happened is not in any shape, way, or form the victim or survivor's fault, but holding the offenders accountable for what had happened. Organizing the service delivery to enhance evidence collection. There's been a lot of movement and talk recently about backlog of evidence collection, kits, and what have you. So a SART can really help address how is that being looked at. Building interagency relationships. We have a previous or another webinar on the SART coordinator, but this would really fall onto the shoulders of a coordinator. It's really helping build relationships and bridges across many of the agencies that are within a SART, and building trust and collaboration within a SART. SARTs would not function without trust and collaboration occurring within. Otherwise, it really does become a meeting that folks show up to and nothing really results from it.
And one anecdote that I can share is when I started out in this world back in the early 2000s, I became a member of the local sexual assault response team, and it was through that program that I was able to connect with the local SANE program, get to know the sex crime detectives, and understand the landscape of the city within which I was working. It was transformational in terms of my capacity to support survivors better, being a part of that multidisciplinary team. And so those relationships are relationships that I still have today. And as you're thinking about what the SART can do, there are tangible things that you can do as a SART, like develop policies, but there are also those intangibles, and they are often relationships. They are often knowledge building around systems and how things work so that you can better serve survivors. And I think that is an important piece to consider when you're thinking about the role of a SART. So we just mentioned protocols. So that's a big one. You'll hear that a lot, that SARTs often develop processes and protocols to streamline responses across all disciplines. This is sometimes where suspicion can manifest, because agencies, so, prosecution, law enforcement, advocacy, whether that's systems-based or community-based, and medical providers, there's this feeling that you're not going to tell me how I need to do my job. And so a protocol for response isn't necessarily the SART coordinator or a small group of people rewriting an agency's policies. It's more about pulling together all of those policies into one place, identifying if there are any gaps, fixing any of those gaps, streamlining services where perhaps something is too clunky, and then creating one document that houses all of those protocols. They're not usually binding. I mean, that would be dependent on your community, but it's really just an acknowledgement that we are trying to work together, and here is how our agency will handle things, which can be really helpful for a survivor or for someone who's looking into, how best to understand the system. So a SART can also educate the community about available intervention and prevention services, those standards of practice. What does that look like? How are we going to respond as a group of people to sex assault survivors, right? Are we going to commit to removing all victim-blaming language from our response? Are we going to commit to victim-centered, offender-focused process? Those kinds of things are what we mean when we say interagency standards of practice versus kind of those nitty-gritty protocol, here's what happens when ABC happens. And then also case review, which is something that SARTs tend to do when they're a little bit more established, but is very, very important and something we would encourage you all to consider implementing.
So where do you even start with all of this? You know you have a problem, or you know you have something that you would like to accomplish, you want to build a SART, but what do you do first? We highly recommend coming up with a small group of stakeholders and determining who needs to be at the table. Now, often what you'll hear are folks that are referred to as champions, but there's also folks that are influencers. So champions are folks that have formal power with an agency. So this may be your police chief, your executive director, someone along those lines that can really make a decision for an entire agency. But what's an influencer? An influencer is someone with informal power, but people believe in them. And we have found that influencers are key when you're building a SART, because they're the ones that folks within an agency will talk to. And if that influencer believes in the SART and can talk it up, you will see a culture change. Agency change can happen, but folks don't necessarily buy into it. When you have an influencer that is also working towards that goal, that's when you'll start to see that culture shift. Also, you want to identify who needs to be at the table. So that, again, falls back onto determining, do you need the champions, the influencers, or maybe you need a mix of both. We have found that a mix tends to be the best solution, because if a SART is identifying problems and coming up with solutions, but you don't have those folks there that can implement change, that won't necessarily work. However, it doesn't, again, necessarily work if the agency doesn't buy into it. You also want to look into relationship development with each of the agencies that are participating in SART. And lastly, you really should look at whether or not you are rural or urban in your community when developing your SART, as both of these have both pros and cons.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot that we could say about rural and urban and things to consider, and it's part of why we don't have a cookie-cutter roadmap for you in terms of establishing a SART and developing those foundations, because it really does manifest differently depending on your community, the size of your community, the history of your community. Like, has your community been one that's fairly progressive in terms of understanding sex assault and wanting to do something about it, or is it a community that believes there's no sex assault that happens there? So those factors really do play into how you establish the SART, and in some cases make those champion/influencer people really, really critical. But thinking about, urban environments may have more resources, but they may have less relationships, right? There may not be as much friendliness between agencies because maybe there are more agencies or there are more people, and so it's just harder to have those stronger relationships. In a smaller community, a lot of people know each other, which can be a good and a bad thing, right? It can be that there's really strong relationships, and so you have some key influences, and it's easy to persuade people, or it could be that there are some deep-seated conflicts that go back a long time that you have to negotiate before you can really move forward with your SART. So these are all things you just need to think about when you're starting out. Another thing to think about is, what are the perceived barriers? So when you have this small group of people who've come together, 3 or 4 people who are looking at establishing a SART, it's really important to identify what barriers are perceived in your community to establishing a successful SART. So identifying them and then trying to address them. Gosia talked about the champions and influences. These are really key as you think about it. If you have a law enforcement agency who is perhaps disinterested in participating in the SART, but there's a sergeant in that law enforcement agency who's super popular and is really bought into the idea of a SART, then that sergeant is going to be really helpful as you start to engage, the deputy chiefs or the chiefs in that department or the sheriff to be able to get the agency to buy in. And so thinking strategically about how best to approach agencies will be a part of this. Remember that the SART can't just be another meeting without structure and purpose. We have so many meetings on our calendars, and it's really easy to ditch a meeting that you think has no value in your life. And so it's really critical that you think about the SART beyond just another meeting that doesn't really achieve much. And so this is connected to having a good, strong SART coordinator to help facilitate those meetings and move things forward between the meetings. And there's another webinar that you can listen to that Gosia and I did about the SART coordinator if you want to learn more about that position. Can be a first step, not always, but definitely should be an early step, so thinking about who your coordinator is going to be.
So when you are looking to develop a SART, it's important to determine who could be potential members for you. And again, remember that not all these folks may join initially. You may identify them down the line, or they may start to hear about this throughout the community and ask to join. That's always a fun way to do it. You don't have to hunt anyone down. But we have identified law enforcement, district attorneys, victim advocates, both system and community, SANE program or medical facility if you don't have a SANE program, probation, child welfare, judges, your crime lab, and schools, and for example, Title IX. We think it's really important to have both system and community-based agencies involved because this really helps out with transparency. It also allows your SART to keep a pulse on what's really happening within your community. We know that not every person reports with law enforcement, so the community-based advocacy agencies are important for that piece, but the community-based folks don't necessarily go through the entire criminal justice system, so they don't necessarily see that side of the coin.
So we've now broken up, our next 3 slides are going to offer kind of what we think would be good first stage components, second stage components, and third stage components, thinking about your implementation as a step-by-step process. Again, to reiterate, you don't want to rush the implementation of a SART. You want to be thoughtful and strategic about how you do this. Move slowly, but I say that and then also think that some communities are able to just move more quickly if there's less people involved, right? So you can judge that based on your own climate and culture. But the goal here would be to think about a house, right? A house with a poor or weak foundation is going to be susceptible to falling down. And so you really want to make sure that you're developing a strong foundation for your SART, because that will set it up for success and for longevity as you think about kind of moving through the steps and thinking about it in the future. So Gosia and I put into the first stage thinking about hiring a coordinator. Now, obviously, there's a financial piece attached to hiring a coordinator. So you might be needing to have even like a pre-first stage where you're looking at grant funding opportunities, or you're looking at agencies who are bought into establishing a SART, and can they each chip in a financial piece to help support having a coordinator. Initially, perhaps you have the coordinator as someone in your agency, and they're doing another job, and then they have 10 hours or so just initially to get the SART started, but we would not recommend that be your ongoing practice because that can become really difficult as the SART establishes its identity and as the workload increases. So we are strongly in favor of standalone SART coordinators who are a neutral party. But understanding that there are financial constraints, you might have to be flexible about that in the beginning. Establishing regular meeting times. This is really important to not have a loosey-goosey schedule, to ensure that there is a time there where it happens, whether that's quarterly or monthly or bi-monthly, and making sure that you stick to that. One structure that we've seen is to have co-chairs. So there is a SART coordinator, but there are two members of the committee of the SART who act as co-chairs, which then kind of embeds leadership within the SART members, which can also help with identity and also help with buy-in. And so the SART coordinator is there. They do follow-up. They do administrative work. They are building relationships. They're developing trainings. But the co-chairs are running the meetings. And then the co-chairs and the coordinators meet regularly to make sure that the SART is on track. Developing mission, vision, and values early on would be important, making sure that those mission, vision, and values come from within the group versus an external person or group. Finding those champions and influencers. Developing some parameters around confidentiality. If you're going to talk about cases in your SART, do you need to have everyone sign a confidentiality agreement, and what does that look like? And then building relationships, which is also kind of a pre-first stage as well. You need to have those relationships to really get off to a good start.
Okay, so stage 2. So as you're building your SART and you're beginning to build those relationships, it's really important that you don't just let those sit. You really want to develop strong relationships. So that way, if there is an issue or a problem that comes up, agencies and folks feel like they can reach out to others and address those without just sitting on that information. We've already discussed guidelines, protocols, and joint response policies, but we highly encourage, if you don't do that in the first stage, to do it in the second one, and definitely revisit those. As we have even noticed here in Colorado, as laws change, as statutes come up, you need to revise these so that way they are up to date with the best practices. We also really encourage, this usually falls on to a SART coordinator role, but to develop a onboarding process for new members. Like I had mentioned, sometimes you can get to a point where your SART has agencies reaching out and asking if they can join. If you are able to accommodate them, or if this is something that you're good to do, you really want to have an onboarding process so they understand what does your SART do and what would be expected of their agency if they were going to come on board. And determine who your regular members are. At the first stages, we typically see folks such as police chiefs, executive directors. Those folks are attending at first. But once they have determined what the SART is and how their agency will interact with it, we have had many police chiefs who then appoint sergeants that attend SART meetings that are able to come back and relay that information at a command staff meeting, for example. So change is still able to be made at that agency, but it's not requiring the time of the police chief to attend.
Okay, so our third stage component, and there could be a fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh stage. We've just decided to do 3 stages here for simplicity. So when you have your regular meeting times, you've built some strong, sustainable relationships, and you're nurturing those relationships in an ongoing way, and you have people regularly coming to your meetings, you have your policy, your protocol, and you're starting to identify gaps, one of the things that we would recommend is that you really think about evaluation. So there's a couple of things to think about here. So one is that you should be tracking data within your community and any system changes that are happening. So how many assaults are being reported, how many medical forensic exams are being done if you have a program, or if you don't have a program, how many survivors are choosing not to engage in the medical forensic exam process because it's too far, right? How many cases are being presented to the DA and how many cases are being filed? What are the outcomes of those cases? Actually starting to track some of that information so that you can better identify gaps as a team. And then the other piece would be how effective is your SART, right? So doing some internal investigation and evaluation about member satisfaction and the goals and the vision and the values that you set in those earlier stages. Are you actually meeting those? And are you feeling effective, or are you feeling like you're spinning your wheels as a group without much direction? So the evaluation piece, I think, is something that often gets lost and forgotten, and we would argue that it's very, very important for a sustainable SART, and also to recognize when you have successes, right, and to be able to celebrate those successes and share data that demonstrates that things are changing and they're changing for the better. Case review is another huge piece of this. And when we think about case review, we don't think about it in the sense of someone shares the story of a case and then there's no discussion, right? When we think about case review, we would ideally recommend that it's actually a dissection of the case, and each person presents their part, and then there's group discussion to identify what went really well and what could have been improved. Because the whole purpose of a case review, in our opinion, is that it seeks to make us better at what we do. But you could end up having a 3 or 4 step process to get to that point, because you need to have a lot of trust between players at the table to be able to get to that point.
And I do want to quickly mention, in terms of case reviews, there is alternatively a few SARTs that we have seen that do real-time case reviews with their district attorney's office, meaning that instead of going to a traditional filing, they actually bring that case to the SART and present it there, and the district attorney's office will make that determination of whether they file or decline at the SART meeting. Again, pros and cons to this. However, it does lend itself to some transparency, because with everyone at the table there and witnessing this, it really provides an opportunity for folks to explain their investigative processes. The DAs have an opportunity to explain why or why didn't they file the case, and community advocates can listen in and perhaps are able to give victim survivors information that they otherwise may not have. So I just wanted to point out that's another case review that you can consider.
Yeah, and actually that made me think of another structure that we've seen with sex assault response teams, is that you have these larger task forces or interagency councils that are primarily information sharing and training based, and they meet less frequently. And then you have a much smaller group of people that meet every couple of weeks or every month, and they do the case reviews. So the case review isn't done in the large group. It's done in a smaller group with the key players around the table from each of the agencies. Because some of the SARTs here in Colorado are 50 people strong, right? They're really thriving. But that's not a forum where you could probably do an effective case review if you're really trying to dissect what happened and do a better job next time. And so the other piece that I'll just throw in, because I just thought of it, is that there's also conversation around whether you do case review on open cases or closed cases. And we have a mixed bag in Colorado. Some SARTs will only do closed cases for review, and as Gosia just described, there are also examples of ones where the cases are open. So other third stage components include grant funding, seeking grant funding. How can you expand your services? How can you perhaps move your coordinator from part-time to full-time? How are you going to sustain your program over the long haul? What buy-in do you need? What things need to change in your community to ensure its sustainability? And then training opportunities. So what are the gaps you've identified in your evaluation or in your discussions of, between agencies, and how can you provide training to better educate folks who are connected to this process and move forward from that place? So I know that Gosia, through her SART, has offered the forensic experiential trauma interviewing study training to a number of people who are connected, and that's been really successful.
Yeah.
So I think what we also want to stress here is that while we've laid this out as 1, 2, 3, and maybe there's 4, 5, 6, it isn't necessarily a linear process. You might find yourself jumping between these components. The work of a SART is always ongoing. It does evolve over time. You may need to revisit steps from earlier, and I think one of the critical pieces is that your SART is nimble and responsive to community needs. The evaluation piece is such a core element of the work of a SART in terms of knowing if you're meeting your goals and then being able to reevaluate and shift as necessary. Best practices emerge, and it's really important to stay on top of those so that your community can adapt and grow and respond more effectively to survivors of sexual assault and hold offenders accountable. And the SART is such a clear vehicle to do this. It just sometimes can get a bit muddy because there are relationships involved and there is conflict, and you just have to do a good job in setting those foundations to be strong so that you can move through those rocky times that are likely at some point. Did you want to add anything, Gosia, to wrap up?
No, yeah. So thank you all for sitting in on this webinar. We hope that you found this to be informational. Our contact information is here. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments. Lisa and I are both passionate about the work that SARTs do and feel that they are so valuable, not only for our communities but across the nation. So if you have anything that you would like to reach out to us for, we are happy to help you in this work.
Great. Thank you so much for a really informative presentation. We really appreciate it. Here are some references that they mentioned throughout their presentation. And I just want to again iterate that NSRC is a national technical assistance provider. We're really happy if you reach out to us with any questions, comments, concerns about any aspect of sexual assault work. Our email is here, as well as a website link with a link to the SART Toolkit. And a lot of the things that were covered in today's webinar have expanded information in the SART Toolkit. It is going to be a first-stop shop for most SARTs. And in the SART Toolkit, there actually are expanded sections on evaluation, on sustainability, with specific resources that go through that. So I'd really recommend it, particularly if those things popped out at you today, to refer to those. And again, I just want to say thank you to our presenters. We really appreciate you being here and sharing all your experiences. And again, thank you to OVC for their support in developing this webinar, as well as all the materials in the Sexual Assault Toolkit. Thank you so much.